House of the Dragon is one of those rare shows that feels determined to impress you from the very first frame. You get dragons. You get castles. You get political backstabbing. And you get a family tree that looks less like a family tree and more like a software engineering flowchart. And somehow, it works. The scale is massive. The visuals are incredible. And whether you're a casual viewer or someone who has accidentally spent 3 hours reading Targaryen lore at 2 in the morning, it's hard not to get pulled into this world. But recently, I've started noticing something. Not a flaw that ruins the show. Not even a mistake. Just a creative choice. That might become a much bigger issue once Season 3 arrives. And before anyone starts sharpening a Valyrian steel sword in the comments, no. This isn't a hate video. I actually think House of the Dragon is one of the strongest fantasy shows currently on television. I've watched every episode. I've followed the discussions. And I've probably spent an unhealthy amount of time thinking about fictional royal succession laws. Which, now that I say it out loud, doesn't sound great. But the reason I'm making this video isn't because the show is failing. It's because it's incredibly close to becoming something truly exceptional. And sometimes, that last step is the hardest one. Because if we're being honest, the production quality is absurd. The dragons don't just look impressive. They feel different. Vhagar feels ancient. Caraxes feels dangerous. Syrax feels elegant. Most fantasy shows struggle to make one dragon memorable. This show somehow gave multiple dragons their own personalities. And it isn't just the dragons. The castles feel lived in. The costumes feel expensive. The sets feel real. Even a conversation around a table somehow feels important. And that's a surprisingly difficult thing to achieve. A lot of fantasy shows can create spectacle. Very few can create atmosphere. House of the Dragon manages both. Which brings us to the real question. If the dragons work, if the world works, if the production works, then why does something still feel slightly off? And I think the answer becomes clearer when we compare House of the Dragon to early Game of Thrones. Because when people talk about what made Game of Thrones special, they usually don't start with the battles. They don't start with the dragons. They start with the characters. And more specifically, they start with the uncertainty surrounding those characters. Take Jaime Lannister. When we first meet him, he's arrogant. He's selfish. And let's be honest, he makes a first impression that is almost impossible to recover from. Yet somehow, over time, he becomes one of the most interesting characters in the entire franchise. Not because he suddenly becomes a good person, but because the show constantly forces us to reconsider who he really is. The same thing happens with Tyrion. He's clever, funny, usually the smartest person in the room. But he's also insecure, proud, sometimes selfish, sometimes wrong. And that's exactly why he feels real. Because people are complicated. And great stories usually understand that. Even someone like the Hound. A character who initially seems violent, cynical, and almost impossible to like, eventually reveals layers of humanity beneath all that anger. And what connects all three of these characters is uncertainty. The audience never completely knows where they stand. And that uncertainty creates tension, even when nobody is fighting. And this is where House of the Dragon faces a very difficult challenge. Because the Dance of the Dragons was never supposed to be a simple story. It's a tragedy. A conflict driven by pride, miscommunication, fear, and a series of decisions that become impossible to undo. Nobody really wins. And that's what makes it fascinating. And to be fair, The show captures a lot of that complexity. Far more than most fantasy series would even attempt. But occasionally, it feels like the adaptation is slightly more interested in clarity than ambiguity. And that's understandable. Ambiguity is difficult. It's risky. And sometimes audiences prefer clear answers. The problem is that ambiguity is exactly what made political drama in Westeros so addictive in the first place. Because once the audience feels completely certain about who is right or who is wrong, something important starts to disappear. Not the spectacle. Not the dragons. The tension. And season 3 might be the moment when that difference becomes impossible to ignore. So the real question isn't whether House of the Dragon is good or bad. Because it clearly is good. The real question is whether it can stay dangerous as a story. Not visually dangerous. Not in terms of scale. But emotionally. Because the best political dramas don't just show events. They make you unsure about how to feel about them. Because once a story becomes too clear about who the good side is, or who the bad side is, it loses a certain kind of tension that can't be replaced with dragons or battles. And that's why season 3 is so important. At this point in the story, everything escalates. Alliances break. Choices become irreversible. And the world stops being about politics and starts becoming about consequences. And if the show leans too heavily into structure, into clear sides, and into simplified moral framing, then it risks losing the very thing that made this world interesting in the first place. Not the dragons. Not the battles. But the uncertainty. The uncomfortable space where you don't fully know who to root for. But that's just my take on it. I'm really curious what you think. Do you feel like the show is moving towards something more structured? Or do you think it's handling that balance perfectly already? Either way, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Because shows like this are always better when people don't agree completely.